Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is a wrap-up slash set of mini-reviews for mid-August 2016. The first book I'm going to talk about is A Nurse at the Front, which are the First World War diaries of Edith Appleton, who was, as it suggests, a nurse at the front during the First World War. And these are her actual diaries that were found. They don't go through the entirety of the war, there are several that are missing, but it's bits and pieces, and it gives you a great sense of what people were dealing with at the time, and a little bit of the sense of place. It's not so much a story or a history on its own as it's a little snippet that gives some context, that element of the war and that element of the societies and everything that were involved. As a book on its own, it's not really telling a story, and the history only comes in notes. Like, there are some bits where she writes down what is essentially gossip about a ship was torpedoed, and she might say, oh, so many people died, and in the footnotes it says, actually only 17 people died. It's a piece of history. It's fascinating. It's worth picking up. And I believe it's all online as well, because her family members have put this all out to reach out to family members of people that she worked with who are mentioned in the diaries, of people who were patients that are mentioned in the diaries. So it's a real historical project. So it's fascinating stuff. Another interesting bit of nonfiction here is Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant by Chast, who I believe is, she's a cartoonist at the New Yorker. This is a memoir of the period where her parents, who were in their 90s, were declining in health and trying to keep their independence, but eventually moving into assisted living, and what that meant to them as a family, and especially with her being both an only child and sort of a late-born child, so her kids were still fairly young when this was going on. And it was really interesting, in part because she very much has a humor, cartoonist style of drawing. So it was really interesting to see the contrast between that and a very heavy subject matter. I think that made it more interesting than, say, something starker and less colorful, because I think you see a lot of memoirs that are sort of black and white, very serious looking art, whereas this is not like that. And even when there are photos, the photos are color photos, and they sort of embrace the gaudiness where there's gaudiness. I thought that it was really interesting. You really get a sense of both their relationship and what it meant to them specifically to be dealing with each other, and also what it means to get older and to decline like that. It was a really interesting read, really worth picking up, I think. I was very impressed with this. Alright, so next up, Constantine the Hellblazer, which is Ming Doyle's run, the first collection of that. There's a second one coming out in the fall. I had read the first few issues of this as they were coming out, and I wasn't a huge fan of them. I didn't feel like they were as Hellblazer-y as I would like. I felt like it was a step in the right direction from the Ray Fox New 52 one, which was fine as a story on its own. It just didn't feel like Hellblazer. It felt more superhero-y. But as a collection, I actually liked this quite a lot. It still has sort of the issue that I feel like all of the new kind of DC universe, as opposed to Vertigo versions of Hellblazer, have been, which is that they try to keep the character's dark side, if you want, that he's still consorting with demons and sex and swearing and cigarettes, but it's slightly, and in the case of swearing, it's actually sort of censored, and that just seems silly. I feel like either make it a mature reader's book or don't, but to sort of do that in between seems silly to me. But I did enjoy this a lot. I thought it was fun. It felt more like Hellblazer when I read it as a collection as opposed to in the single issues. So yeah. I also read Hellblazer Pandemonium, which was the 25th anniversary of the character release from a little while ago, which is written by Jamie Delano, who didn't create the character. I think that was Alan Moore, but he did write the original run on Hellblazer. So he created a lot of the background and the typical stuff that the character has. This, unlike that last one, it was a Vertigo release, so it doesn't. So I mean, when demonesses show up, they're appropriately naked, and when he swears, he's actually swearing. As stories go, it was reasonably topical. It was maybe not as dark or as uncomfortable as some of the stories, especially when I think of the last kind of runs on Hellblazer, like when Peter Milligan was writing it. A lot of it I thought was very uncomfortable to read in an interesting way, and this wasn't particularly uncomfortable. It was interesting though, and it was very much Hellblazer-y, which, given what's been going on with the character more recently, I liked seeing that. I would rather see the character doing stuff like this than doing, Justice League Dark kind of stuff. So, yeah, it was a fun read. Another one was M.G. Vassanji's No New Land, which is, I had an interesting conversation. I was reading this at the optometrist's office, and the secretary was asking me what it was about, and I was trying to describe it to her, and it's not a plot-driven book, so it's hard to describe what it's about and be true to the book. So I was kind of saying, well, it's this guy, and he's been accused of sexual harassment, but that's actually not what most of the book is about. There's a little bit at the beginning and a little bit at the end that are about that, but it's really sort of viginettes in this family's story. And they are South Asians from Tanzania who then moved to Toronto in the 70s. So you get little scenes from different generations and different people and their friends and what they've done. And it's more about the sense of place than it's about the plot. This is the same writer who did Book of Secrets, which traveled sort of a similar history with the same community. And this, I believe, was published before that. And it's shorter, so it's definitely less in-depth than that is. But it's a similar style of writing where the focus is less the story than the place and the sense of where the people are in their lives as opposed to what's happening in their lives. I really like the style of this writing, and it's been, I don't know, probably 15 years or more since I've read Book of Secrets, but this made me want to read it again. It's not a book where if somebody asks you, what is it about? You can't give them the plot because that's just not the point. Finally, I have The Autumn Republic, which is the third book in the Powder Mage trilogy. First two I mentioned in my July wrap-up. This was, I would say, not necessarily the strongest book in the series, but it was an acceptable close. I really like this series. They are military fantasy. It's like the Napoleonic War, but with magic. The world building is great. I have to say, a lot of fantasy epics have a map at the beginning, and it's just there, so you can imagine where the places are. But in this, it actually made sense to look at it when they're talking about the movements of the military forces and when people are escaping if they're trying to flank a different group. The geography mattered, and I liked how thought out that was in terms of where the mountains are, where the valleys are. And I think the geography was almost an extra character in the book. Characters, at least the main characters, I think were really well developed. Some of the secondary characters didn't have quite as much, but I actually like that because I think there's some kind of a trend in fantasy writing in general to overdo all the backstory. There are apparently extra backstories. The author has self-published a bunch of novellas and read the backstory, but I liked that they weren't core to the story. I thought that the pacing was great, and in military fantasy you want to see good battle descriptions, and you get that here. It's fantastic. The magic system is interesting, presented as something that's evolving. So when I read the first couple of books, one thing that concerned me is I like magic to have rules, and it felt like it didn't have rules, but as it goes on, you see that it's being presented as something that's in constant evolution, and it's in constant flux, and it's something that the characters themselves don't necessarily understand. So that grew on me. I liked that. And aside to that, one thing that I think is sort of maybe a nitpicky issue, but a lot of fantasy that has healing magic in it seems to have trouble with then how they present disability. And I thought this series did a great job of showing what the limits of healing magic are and doing it in a way that didn't fall into kind of tropey things. Or when I was talking about the first two books in my July wrap-up, I mentioned that it was very much plot-driven, and it is, although near the end when the plot is more or less wrapped up, but they're just tying up loose ends. There were a few bits where I felt like it needed an extra chapter or two. There are a few near deaths where I think it was almost supposed to be a twist, but it wasn't, because as a reader, you don't sort of buy into it the way presumably the characters are meant to. But that's stuff that happens at the very end of the book, so I mean, 90% of this I think is great fun. I don't imagine Napoleonic battles with magic. This is your book, or this is your series. These do a great job of that. The action scenes are great. The plot is reasonable. The characters are mostly good. And they cover a wide age range. It's not like there's one, mature general and one young upstart. There's a retired policeman. There's a field marshal. There's, some 20-something military guys. There is a teenager. She was sort of interesting in that her character, you almost wonder why she's there at the beginning, and that kind of evolves. I wasn't a huge fan of how suddenly her sort of plot importance jumped in. You start out wondering, why does she have so much focus? But that does become clear eventually. I don't know if she's going to show up in the next series. There's another series coming out, and I've heard that some of the secondary characters in this are going to feature in that. So that will be interesting to see. I think in a book like this, you're not necessarily reading it for a perfect wrap-up of that. You're reading it because you want to see the world and you want to see the battles. And these deliver on those. So, yeah, 2 thumbs up. And that's it for the first 15 days of August. I didn't read anything that I hated, so that's always good. You had a good first half of August. Ciao.